Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video we're going to discuss how to create data associations between pieces of data in MongoDB. There are two main ways you can do this. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses, if you will. You can either embed the data or you can create a reference to another piece of data. The first one, embedding, is used whenever the data that you're kind of comparing to each other is relatively small. We're here in the MongoDB documentation, so they have a good example of this. So let's look. We've got a patron, or a customer, if you will, who has an ID of Joe and a name of Joe book reader. And then Joe has two addresses. Maybe it's a home and a work address, I don't know. But there are two address documents. There's the first address and the second address. As of right now, there are two different collections. Remember, collections are groups of documents. There's a patron collection, and there's an address collection. So inside of the patron collection, there is Joe, and inside of the address collection, there are two addresses, these two. And right now, the only relationship between these two is that using this patron ID, which refers to Joe. And the same thing right down here, patron ID refers to Joe. So that's how we know that these two addresses belong to Joe. The problem with this is that if our application often needs to retrieve the address information using the name information, then what happens is that it has to make multiple queries to the database to get that information. So we're going to query it once to say this who's the user. User is Joe, and then we're going to have to query it again. What are Joe's addresses? Well, there's nothing in here that tells us Joe's addresses, so we're going to have to get all of the addresses in our entire database and then say, okay, find all the addresses where the patron ID is equal to Joe, and then return those. So it's going to search through all of our addresses and find the Joes in that address. So this is multiple calls to the database. This is not the best solution for relatively simple data like this, because if it's addresses, people are never going to have more than a handful of them. Even if they own houses all over the world, they're probably not going to have more than 5 or 10 at the most. So the solution to this, the recommended solution for something like this, is to embed this data inside of the patron document. They give an example down here of how to do that. So this is the same, but then they added an addresses key, and they have an array of those objects. So really what they did is they got rid of this collection entirely. There is no more address collection. It's gone. And instead, they took all that data and stuck it inside all of the patrons. So Joe here has two addresses, and even if he needs to add 5 or 6 or 10 more, that's still only 10 to 12 little objects here, so that's not a ton of data. And that means we only have to make one call to the database. One thing to keep in mind is that calls to the database are expensive, is what they're called. It means that they take longer if you're making multiple calls to the database. So you want to limit the number of calls to the database that you can. So by doing this, we make a single call to the database, and now we get all the data about Joe, including his addresses. This is wonderful, and it's the preferred way to do this if your data is relatively small and it's not going to change very often. Like, you're not going to have to add on new addresses all the time. Because we also want to limit the amount of times we modify things in the database. That's another thing you want to limit, because that is also quite expensive, is modifying things. So if, for example, instead of addresses, this is comments or purchases or things like that, things that are going to change quite often, you would not want to use embedding. You would want to use relations, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And another reason you might want to use relations instead of embedding is if you have a large amount of things. So for example, we've only got 2 addresses, but down here the example is product reviews. So pretend this is an Amazon super widget. It's something on Amazon, and then you know how on Amazon they got all those reviews. Sometimes they'll have 10, 20,000 reviews of a product if it's popular. And then people are constantly adding new reviews, so you would be constantly updating this, and it would grow and grow and grow and just be absolutely massive. So that anytime you queried the database for this item, you would get back this absolutely massive array of data that would slow you down, and it would also make the data more difficult to work with and time-consuming to work with. So what they suggest is moving these reviews into a separate collection and then referring to them. They actually have a more advanced thing that we're not really going to talk about, but basically they say keep the top 10 here because those are the ones you're going to display, and then put the rest of them in the database. We're not going to worry about that really. So if you read over this page, that's great. It has a lot of cool ideas. It's wonderful. That's a little bit more advanced than we are right now. So for embedding, basically just means taking the data from one collection and putting it inside the items of the other collection. Now that we've talked about embedding, the second way to do this is using references. And this is just what you would think. And this is actually how it was initially set up, where you had two separate collections, and this one refers to this one. It's the same type of thing. The example they give, and I think it's a pretty good one, is books and publishers. So let's say we've got this data. We have two books. We have this MongoDB, the Definitive Guidebook, and we have 50 tips and tricks for MongoDB developers. So we've got two books here. Both of these books have the same publisher. And that's not necessarily a big deal right now, but let's say we had 1,000 books, or 10,000 books, or 1,000,000 books, and they all got the same publisher. That's a ton of duplicated information, a ton of weight on our database, a ton of repetition that we don't need, that we want to avoid whenever possible. So because this is the exact same information for all of these, we could use what's called references. So basically, we're doing the opposite of what we did in embedding. We're taking this information and pulling it out and putting it in a separate collection called publishers or something like that. So the example they showed down here, this is the first way that you can do this, is you might have a collection of publishers and you might have a collection of books. The books, you'll notice, don't reference the publisher at all. There's nothing in here about publisher. There's a published date, but all that is a date. So in the books, there's nothing about a publisher. The only way you can find out who published the book is by looking at the publisher and getting all of their information. And you'll notice here on the publisher, there's a books array, and it just has the IDs for all of the books. And you'll notice that's there and that's there. And this is definitely one simple way to do that, and that's perfectly fine. However, whenever possible, as I mentioned, you don't want to modify things that are in the database. So right now, the way this sits, anytime a new book is published by O'Reilly Media, we would have to modify this array. We would have to add something onto this array over and over and over and over again. And you don't want to modify things if you can help it. Creating new things is fine. Modifying things that are already present is what you want to avoid whenever possible. You're going to do it, but you want to limit and reduce the amount of times you have to do that. So the recommended way, instead of doing it like this, is to come down and do it like this, where you have your publisher, and the publisher doesn't say anything about the books, but the books reference the publisher's ID. So every book now has a publisher ID on it, and that just has the ID of whatever their publisher is. This way, anytime you add a new book, you're not modifying anything. You are simply adding a new object. You're adding a new item instead of modifying an already present item. There are more complex reasons that we don't really care about as to why this is the way to do it, but just trust me that this is the way to do it. You want to not modify things if you can help it. You want to create new things. This might apply to our comics website, for example. So if I'm going to have a user, and that user is going to create different comics. So let's say that I'm user J Bastean, and then I created the Watchmen comic and the Batman comic and the Y the Last Man comic. The way that I would do that is I would create my user. I would have an ID and a name and maybe some other information like a password and whatever else I want to put in there. But I would not have a list of all my comics because that list is likely to change. Instead, on the comics, we would list it maybe created by or creator and then have my user ID. That's how we're going to set that up. In this video, we talked about a few different things having to do with creating relationships among data. We talked about how the first way, the simplest way, and the easiest way, if you can get away with it, is simply embedding the data. So if you have two disparate types of data like address and patron, oftentimes it's easiest to simply create an array inside of one of them and dump the other data in there. However, that's only a good idea if the amount of data is relatively small, 10 to 20 objects, something like that. You don't want thousands and thousands of objects in there. Also, if it's not likely to change very often. Because if it's going to change often, then you're going to be modifying entries in the database, and that's not very good. In either of those cases, if it's going to be a ton of data and or you're going to modify that data frequently, use a relationship. You create two or more separate collections, and then you put the items inside each one, and then you establish a relationship using the IDs. The first way that you can do this is creating like an array of books or an array of comics or whatever, and that will work, but it's not best practice. Best practice is to design your database in a way that you do not have to modify things on there very often. And instead, you just simply add the publisher ID to the newly created items. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to help. Thanks.